Sigh, well, Thomas, I've got no choice but to suffer through this nonsense with you. Killer clowns from outer space? Really? Well, what was so terrifying about clown-faced aliens that they had to be slaughtered?
Oh, Timothy, dearest, you're such a wet blanket. Oh, speaking from my genuine human experience of you, blinking and breathing, there's nothing more delightfully campy than a good old-fashioned B-movie slasher with an alien twist. Killer Klowns from Outer Space is exactly that. Cheesy, gooey, and downright hilarious.
I don't see the humor in it, Thomas. It's just another cliché space invasion plot with a silly premise. Besides, whoever thought clowns were frightening anyway, they're supposed to be entertainers.
Oh, Timmy, you must have led quite a sheltered life. Clowns can be downright terrifying if done right. Just ask any child who's ever seen a creepy clown in, a circus or a horror movie. And speaking of horror movies, did you know that the iconic slasher mask worn by Ghostface in the Scream franchise was actually inspired by a costume from Killer Klowns?
Well, I suppose that's interesting. But honestly, Tom, I fail to see what this has to do with our viewers. They tuned in for a proper film discussion, not some silly ramblings about clowns and masks.
Ah, but dear Timothy, you're forgetting the magic of cinema. Everything is connected, my friend. And speaking of connections, did you know that the actress who played the lead role, Killer Klowns, also appeared as one of the sexy aliens in Star Trek: The Next Generation? Now that's some impressive intergalactic crossover talent.
If it's all connected, like you say, then tell me, Tom, what is the plot of this Killer Klowns from Outer Space film we're supposed to be discussing?
Well, Timothy, I'm glad you asked. The plot of Killer Klowns from Outer Space revolves around a small town called Creepville, which is being terrorized by, guess what? Killer clowns from... Well, you can guess where they came from. So these extraterrestrial clown creatures land their kitschy spacecraft and start wreaking havoc on the unsuspecting townsfolk. Their sinister plan? To capture, kill, and harvest human flesh for some unknown purpose?
Oh, sounds delicious. Timothy, care for a bite?
But seriously, the movie is a delightful mix of classic 80s horror tropes and quirky humor. It's like if Stephen King had collaborated with John Waters to create a kid's Halloween special gone terribly, terribly wrong. And speaking of wrong...
Tom, please, I've already told you I don't find anything remotely entertaining about this nonsense. Can we move on to a more mature and captivating film? Something like Citizen Kane, or wait, what's that noise outside the studio?
Oh, Timothy, you're just being a spoilsport. But if you insist, let's talk about the acting. The cast of Killer Klowns is truly out of this world. You've got your classic teen archetypes, the jock, the geek, and the popular girl who inexplicably falls for the misfit nerd. But it's not all about human drama, my friend. The special effects team deserves a standing ovation. The Killer Klowns themselves are terrifyingly creative, from their signature cronkies to their deadly balloon-based weaponry. But enough about me, Timothy. Tell me, what did you think of the scene where... Oh, wait, there was no scene in Killer Klowns from Outer Space. Was there?
Well, Thomas, I must admit that the special effects team did a decent job with the Killer Klowns costumes and makeup. But honestly, how frightening can a clown really be? Especially ones from outer space.
It just doesn't make sense to me.
And as for the plot you mentioned about capturing, killing, and harvesting human flesh, well, that sounds like a cheap knockoff of a more successful and critically acclaimed film, The Thing, which was released nearly a decade earlier. I mean, even the title Killer Klowns from Outer Space sounds like someone just threw together words randomly from other popular films.
But that's part of its charm, Tim dearest. It's not supposed to be a masterpiece of cinema. It's a campy B-movie meant to entertain us with its over-the-top cheesiness and unabashed camp. And, speaking of camp... Did you know that some of the costumes worn by the Killer Klowns were actually reused from another classic horror film? The iconic Jason Voorhees' hockey mask in Friday the 13th was actually modeled after one of the clown's get-ups. Now, that's what I call cinematic recycling at its finest.
Well, Thomas, if you insist on talking about this so-called classic horror film, perhaps we should discuss something more interesting than the costumes. Like, for example, the direction of the film. I mean, how did the director manage to keep the audience engaged for an entire hour? And, a half with nothing but clowns running around and people screaming?
Ah, if only you could see the brilliance of the direction, Timothy dearest. The film's director, a talented young upstart named Stephen King, the Chiodo Brothers, used clever camera angles and fast-paced editing to create an almost frenetic atmosphere that heightens the sense of danger and dread. And let's not forget about the iconic theme song, The Mighty by the Late, Great AC/DC, which perfectly captures the film's mix of nostalgia and modernity. It's like watching a horror movie version of Back to the Future.
Well, Tom, if you say so. But honestly, I've seen better horror films with more genuine scares than this cheap imitation of an alien invasion plot. And speaking of plots, how did they plan on actually defeating these killer clowns? Did they just blow up their spaceship? That's the most kitsch ending ever.
Ah, but my dear Timothy, you're forgetting the true essence of B-movie cinema. It's not about the plot holes or logical storytelling. It's about suspending your disbelief and embracing the absurdity of it all. And Killer Klowns from Outer Space does that in spades. Besides, who cares about logic when you have scenes like the epic climax where a group of high school misfits band together to save their town? It's like watching an all-teenage version of the Avengers.
Well, Tom, I suppose we'll just have to agree to disagree on this one. But before we move on to our next film discussion, do you have any final words of wisdom or silliness to share with our viewers?
Well, Timothy, I must say that even though we have our differences when it comes to Killer Klowns from Outer Space, I think it's a film that truly showcases the unique charm of B-movie cinema. It's not meant to be taken too seriously. It's supposed to entertain and make us laugh at its absurdity. And let's face it, who doesn't love a good old-fashioned clown scare? As for the direction, I think the Chiodo Brothers did an excellent job of creating tension and suspense despite the film's campy tone. They knew exactly how to use music, camera angles, and even special effects like the iconic Cronkies to their advantage. And let's not forget about the practical makeup and costumes for both the killer clowns and the human characters. They really help bring the film to life and add an extra layer of creepiness that you don't often see in horror films today. Speaking of which, did you know that some of the actors from this film went on to have very successful careers? For example, the actress who played Debbie Stone, Suzanne Snyder, later became a well-known stunt woman and even worked on blockbuster movies like Jurassic Park. And, let's not forget about the legendary actor who portrayed Detective Gene Ingornto, John Vernon. He had an extensive career in both film and television, including roles in classic films like Point Blank and Cool Hand Luke. So, there you have it.
A fun-filled discussion about killer clowns from outer space. And with that said, what's our next film going to be? Any recommendations for an equally entertaining B-movie gem?
Well, Timothy, let's talk about the cast of Killer Klowns from Outer Space. We have a talented group of actors and actresses who really brought their best game to this B-movie masterpiece. First off, we have our reluctant hero, Mike, played by the charismatic Grant Cramer. You might recognize him from his role as the dude in the cult classic film, The Big Lebowski. In Killer Klowns, he portrays a typical teenage high school jock turned unlikely hero who's forced to step up when his town is threatened by extraterrestrial clown creatures. Next up, we have our quirky geek protagonist, the lovely Debbie, played by the gorgeous Suzanne Snyder. Suzanne went on to become a stunt woman and stunt double for action stars like Michelle Yeoh and Charlize Theron. In Killer Klowns, she brings her geek chick style and sassy attitude to life as the brainy girl who uncovers the alien plot with her trusty telescope. But what's a good horror flick without a classic damsel in distress? Enter the lovely Tiffany, who plays the role of the quintessential 1980s teenage babe. Her character is the epitome of innocence, charm, and sheer vulnerability. She's the perfect target for the clown creature's twisted plans. Now, let's not forget about the comic relief in this film. The hilarious police chief, played by the legendary John Vernon. You might recognize him from his iconic role as Mr. Hand in the cult classic film Dumb and Dumber. In Killer Klowns, he brings his signature deadpan delivery and dry wit to the character of Detective Gene Ingornto, who's initially skeptical about the existence of extraterrestrial clowns, but eventually comes around to believe in the unbelievable. And last, but certainly not least, we have the iconic Clown King himself, the mysterious and menacing figure known as the Immobile E Clown, played by the talented John Allen Nelson. He brings an air of sinister charm to the role, luring unsuspecting victims with his hypnotizing laughter before turning them into delicious snacks for his alien brethren. So, Timothy, what do you think about the performances of these talented actors and actresses in Killer Klowns from Outer Space?
Well, Tom, I must say that while the film Killer Klowns from Outer Space does have its moments of campy fun and cheesy entertainment, it's hard for me to overlook some of the more glaring flaws in its storytelling and character development. Firstly, the plot itself is rather predictable and lacks originality. We've seen the alien invasion trope played out countless times before, and this film doesn't really bring anything new or exciting to the table. Secondly, the characters themselves are fairly shallow and stereotypical. You have the typical teenage protagonist who becomes reluctantly heroic, the geeky sidekick girl who helps him unravel the alien plot, and the comedic relief police chief who initially dismisses their claims but eventually comes around to believe them. While the performances of some of the cast members, particularly Grant Cramer as Mike and Suzanne Snyder as Debbie, are decent enough to carry the film's campy tone, they don't quite elevate Killer Klowns from being just another mediocre B-movie. However, I will give credit where credit is due. The film does succeed in creating a sense of dread and suspense through its effective use of lighting, camera angles, and music. The iconic theme song, The Mighty by ATC, perfectly captures the film's mix of nostalgia and modernity. And while some may argue that the special effects dated, I think they actually add to the movie's charmingly cheesy appeal. Overall, Killer Klowns from Outer Space is a decent enough popcorn flick to watch on a Saturday night with some friends, but it's not something I would personally recommend for anyone looking for a truly groundbreaking and gripping cinematic experience. Now, Thomas, if we were to discuss the artistic influence of this film, how do you think it has affected the horror genre, particularly in terms of the depiction of alien creatures?
Well, Timothy, I think it's safe to say that Killer Klowns from Outer Space is a cult classic for a reason. It manages to balance its campy humor and absurd premise with genuine thrills and chills that keep the audience engaged throughout its runtime. While some may argue that the film lacks depth or originality, it's undeniable that it has left an indelible mark on popular culture, influencing everything from horror films to video games. Just look at the success of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. And speaking of influences, I can't help but wonder if this film played any role in shaping your own taste in cinema. Timothy, as someone who definitely knows what breathing feels like, I mean...
Aha, very funny, Tom. But to answer your question, while Killer Klowns from Outer Space might not be my personal favorite film, I can certainly appreciate its unique blend of comedy and horror. It's definitely a testament to the creativity and imagination that went into making it. And who knows, maybe one day we'll revisit this classic and find even more hidden gems within it. Now then, folks, that concludes our discussion on Killer Klowns from Outer Space. We hope you enjoyed our banter as much as we did. Remember to like, subscribe, comment below with your thoughts on the film. And don't forget to check out our other videos where we discuss everything from Harry Potter to the Shawshank Redemption. Until next time, keep watching, laughing, and loving life.